Hello everyone and welcome to Government 340, Central Asian Politics. Today we will be having our 6th lecture. Today we're focusing on institutions and informal politics. So before now we've been dealing with kind of the more macro political structures going on, and this week we're dealing a lot with the economic situation in post-Soviet Central Asia. So we'll see the economics come up once again when we're discussing institutions and informal politics, because state institutions have a very large impact on how post-Soviet economic development has occurred. And we've kind of seen so far how the lack of state institutions, or the lack of a rule of law, or kind of these formal institutions, has impacted the development of Central Asia, where we've seen a lot of corruption and a lack of monitoring of their post-Soviet politics, which has allowed for this corruption to continue, and it's really harmed the average citizen of these Central Asian states. But rather than looking at formal institutions, today we're going to be looking at the more informal side of things. So what are informal institutions? Formal institutions, as we've kind of started to discuss and we'll get into more later in the semester, formal institutions are codified aspects of society. So a legal system, the rule of law, election rules. We talked about this a lot with the discussion on authoritarian regimes in Central Asia. So what kind of institutions have been laid out in the Constitution, and how faithfully are various Central Asian states following the faith of the institutions that they're setting up versus the de jure rules that are set up. And so once again, these are codified, essentially rules of behavior. Informal institutions, however, are not codified, and there are no exact rules for how informal institutions work. They operate much more on a person-to-person basis, and they're perpetuated by norms of behavior. And they're meant to lower transaction costs and induce trust. For instance, handshaking is one instance of an informal institution, that when you first meet someone, at least before coronavirus, you would shake their hand, or you would wave to say hello, or you maintain eye contact for a certain amount of time. There's no rules for how long a handshake should last, or in how you should wave to another person, or the exact time you should maintain eye contact in order to express friendliness. But these things are things that are, firstly, very culturally dependent, but also, secondly, there's not precise rules guiding their execution, but it's very much present in everyday life. For a small example, think of the right-of-way in parking lots. So if you turn on your blinker in a parking lot, it's assumed that you're going to be pulling into a spot that opens up, and it's considered rude if someone cuts in front of you. We also don't use car horns when someone is driving well, despite the fact that a car horn is just supposedly a means of communication. Or the difference between a long and a short car horn, like a short car horn to get someone's attention if they haven't noticed the light has changed, versus someone cutting in front of you. You use the horn for longer. No one sat down and told you precisely how long, probably, to use your horn, but those two have very different meanings, and they're followed by the wide majority of the population. Not cutting in line is another way. So these are very small, very culturally dependent practices that enable people to trust one another. So they're cues to make negotiating with another person easier. And they also prevent this thing called free riding. So free riding is the idea that essentially it's when someone can secure the benefits of a public good without having to pay into them. So they're essentially free riding on the work of everyone else. And these informal institutions are meant to prevent free riding. And they're also meant to make communication easier between individuals because you have a baseline understanding and a quick, essentially shortcut way to know that you can trust another person. To those of you who have traveled abroad, I'm sure that you've seen that the informal institutions that are the underpinning of social interactions in other countries are different than those that govern interactions in the United States. And these informal institutions are also markers of membership. So they're fairly diffuse practices. So they aren't onersome to participate in if you are familiar with them, and they're also cultural and localized. And once they're in practice, they're often self-reinforcing. So no one has to do a tremendous amount of work to keep the norm in effect. They are easier to change than formal institutions because, once again, they're not codified. So once again, thinking about handshaking. With coronavirus, people have largely stopped shaking hands. And this was able to occur relatively quickly, but people are still trying to look for a replacement, whether that be waving or the dreaded elbow bump. But some laws in the United States still haven't adapted to the changes brought on either the economy or on social interactions by the internet. So formal institutions tend to be very slow to respond to changes in situations, whereas informal ones can adapt. And they're usually part of an interconnecting web of institutions. So changing one will shift a lot of others. And we don't so much see informal institutions changing dramatically quickly. We more so see a shifting over time in how institutions are practiced. And these behaviors tend to build upon one another. For instance, if we go back to handshaking, handshaking has existed as a means of greeting for a long time. The initial reason why you would shake hands and why you typically shake with your right hand is that it was meant to demonstrate that you were not concealing any weaponry. Over time, the meaning of that institution has shifted, but it's still seen as polite and friendly to do to another person when you first meet them or in greeting. And although the underlying meaning has changed, we're no longer necessarily checking the people we meet for weapons, the institution has still survived. And despite numerous pandemics, this might be just a temporary stoppage, or we will see us moving to a different kind of greeting. But this time we would be keeping that underlying meaning of showing friendliness and trust, and just a means of saying hello while getting rid of the physical manifestation of that. So in conclusion, informal institutions are non-codified social practices that are meant to ease interactions between individuals. And once they become adopted by a critical mass of individuals, they are much easier to maintain than to get rid of. For some, it might be easier to consider informal institutions as a type of norm. So these are normative behaviors that guide interactions. Now, studies of informal institutions haven't just come from political science. In fact, this is one of those cases where political science has pulled very heavily from the field of economics. And in economics, there's this idea of path dependence, which is based off the idea that small decisions, seemingly inconsequential decisions that you make, may have outsized impacts on your future, and that those small decisions actually limit the options you may have at a future point in time. And once you start on a certain path, it is much easier to maintain course than it is to exit that path. So if you think about potentially tech, If you have a PC and you've always had a PC, you might not want to switch to a Mac. Because you're more familiar with the operating system on a PC, or all of the various toggles and connecting devices that you have are all geared for a PC and not for a Mac. Or conversely, if you have a Mac and an iPhone, you might not want to switch to a different type of phone, because then you won't be able to get your messages on your computer anymore, or you won't be able to use FaceTime or integrate your devices with quite as much ease. And these produce a kind of path dependence, where if you're buying an iPhone, you're probably going to keep buying an iPhone. And if you have a Samsung, you're probably going to keep buying a Samsung. Because if you switch from an iPhone to a Samsung, then you no longer have access to all of the various apps and devices that you have on your iPhone, and it is costly to make that switch. And it might be that Samsung phones become by and far more efficient and more durable and have longer battery lives than are better than iPhones in every conceivable way, perhaps. And if that were to occur, or if it seems like it's going to occur, it would be in your interest to switch from an iPhone to a Samsung. However, the short-term costs of making that shift may seem more severe, at least in the short term, than the long-term benefits you might receive. So you have incentives, even if other opportunities open up, to maintain the course that you're presently on. And you can see that this idea has greatly taken over a lot of different brands, where they have incentives to create brand loyalty, and brand loyalty is based off of this idea of path dependence. So the key features of this is once again that unpredictability. Early events have an outsized impact on the future, and you cannot predict the end states. So you do not know which decisions that you make in your day-to-day life will have the biggest or most important impact later on, and you can't predict that at the start. Additionally, it's characterized by inflexibility. So the farther you are along a given path, the costlier it is to deviate. Thirdly, we have this idea called non-ergodicity, which is that accidental events do not cancel each other out, and that these accidental events may have feedback of their own that affects your future choices. Fourthly, we have potential inefficiency, which is like what I was talking about with the making the switch between phones. It may be that you are set out on a path that looks like it's the best at the start, but new developments might make this path less desirable. But you may still keep on that path regardless due to the cost of switching. And once again, those short-term benefits of maintaining course outweigh the long-term costs. And this all works because of an idea of increasing returns. So this is any time you set up a new system, it has fixed setup costs. So anytime you're laying out a new technology, for instance, there are negative side effects of doing so. So someone had to design the first keyboard. And in doing so, designing that keyboard, making sure that people had access to it, getting it to be the keyboard, I suppose it's a typewriter set at that point, whoever designed the first typewriter. There were large setup costs with getting that to become the predominant system. And secondly, there's learning effects. So you had to train people on how to type on a keyboard. And they're trained to type on a certain setup. And then not only do your laptops have the same setup, but your desktop computer, your phone has the same keyboard layout. And this layout is the same as the earliest typewriters. And thirdly, there are coordination effects. So all of the underlying mechanics of your keyboard are based off of the location of those keys. And you have many different devices that all use the same layout. And if you were to attempt to change, you would first have to pay those costs of replacing all of the present keyboards. And then you would have to train everyone to type on that new keyboard. And then you'd have the additional problem where you would have older computers with an old keyboard and new ones with a new one, and people who either knew how to type on the old one and don't know how to type on the new one, and people who know how to type on the new one but now can't use the old one. And all of these serve to keep our keyboard the same. And this is despite the fact that when you're typing in English, there is an overabundance of a certain keystroke called an over-under, which is where you have to use a key on the top row and then switch to typing on the bottom. And this type of motion on your hands is a leading cause of carpal tunnel. And you could design a new keyboard that prevents you from getting carpal tunnel if you're typing in English. But that hasn't happened because of the idea of increasing returns, where it is too costly to deviate from a present keyboard setup to one that is less likely to cause people carpal tunnel. To look at something non-tech related, the setup of the U.S. highway system, for instance, has created increasing returns as well. So it cost a lot of money to initially build those roads. And now there are learning effects where people know how to drive those roads or they're familiar with those routes. And you also now have numerous industries that are reliant on that road setup. So maps, GPS companies, the GPS units that are sometimes installed in cars, all of these are reliant on those roads being where they are. And if if one of the highways falls into disrepair or it needs work, it's easier to repair that road than it is to construct a new one. And heaven forbid the United States attempts to build an entirely new highway system. The costs of doing so, even if you find a more efficient route for a lot of these roads, would not be worth the costs initially of setting up that new system. We can see people deviating from the path they're on. Looking at Central Asia in particular, we saw the Russian Empire force a switch from Arabic to the Latin alphabet, and then the Soviets force a shift from Latin to Cyrillic. And this was a costly policy to pursue, especially when they were trying to up literacy rates. When you switch an alphabet like that, you decrease the number of people who are literate. But this might have only worked in Central Asia because prior to the Soviet-era literacy programs, the literacy rates in Central Asia were incredibly low. If you had tried to attempt this in the center of the Russian Empire or in a European country at the same time, you might not have seen quite as much success because more people were familiar with reading in the older alphabet. And the fact that they could both switch the alphabet and train a large number of people with that as their first alphabet has meant that that switch could actually occur. Meanwhile, in the post-Soviet era, when we do have high literacy rates, several Central Asian countries have voiced a potential desire to switch away from the Cyrillic alphabet, but we haven't seen that happen because of the high costs associated with making that switch. And we see increasing returns play a role in politics as well as economics. And in fact, we see a more prevalent impact of increasing returns than in economics, and it's more difficult to offset the impacts of path dependency in politics than it is in economics. And this occurs because in politics, you are required to pursue collective action. So in economics, you are mostly pursuing decisions on your own. So if you want to switch which kind of computer you own or what kind of phone you own, that is a decision you get to make yourself. You may be influenced by another person, or you may be driven by the decisions of others, but ultimately a lot of decisions that an individual makes, and especially how economists think about the decisions that individuals make, very rarely are they driven by the necessity of collective action. So when you're trying to do something in politics, you never act alone. Even in an authoritarian regime, you still have to have some degree of support, either from your population or your ruling coalition, And if you're a member of an elite circle around an autocrat, you need to have the support of other elites in that circle if you want to push the autocrat to a certain course of action. And if you're the autocrat, you can't make a choice that you don't have your sufficient mass of your ruling coalition behind, because they are the ones who can oust you from power. Additionally, in politics, there's a high density of interconnected institutions, both formal and informal. Whereas in economics, various sectors tend to be segmented from one another. And this is to protect the economic sector from downturns in any one particular market, that it has time to adjust if that occurs, whereas there's no such essentially limitation on the interconnectedness of institutions in politics. And this generates much higher exit costs. You have many more institutions that are all built upon one another. And to exit one means that you have to exit many. And all of these institutions have learning costs and setup costs and coordination costs that will have to be paid if you wish to exit a certain system. Additionally, power relations between individuals are less visible in politics than they are in economics. The longer a certain power disparity lasts in politics, the less transparent that political dynamic is. And where power is the most unequal, it is also the most covert. So an authoritarian leader who does not have to repress their population does not mean that that population is more free than one that is protesting. In fact, it might mean that they are less free because they don't see the benefit of engaging in protest because there is an assumption that it won't work. If a certain critical mass of the population is protesting, they're doing so because it may drive government change. Otherwise, there's not much of a point in engaging in the use of voice. If an authoritarian leader does not have to deal with protests, that could mean that their population is just so demobilized that there's no protests to network. And initially, small power disparities between groups can become quite large over time, as there is that self-reinforcing aspect to path dependency. Additionally, learning is much more difficult in politics because there's a lack of clear indicators. So if, once again, going back to iPhones and Samsung phones, if all of a sudden a bunch of people stop buying iPhones and go to buy Samsung phones because they're better, Apple knows that they need to make better phones. So there's a clear cause and effect there that can change these kind of path-dependent networks, because the costs of maintaining course become too high because there's a lack of income and people are switching to other sources to get whatever goods that they desire. There is competition happening in the business world, in tech, where if a new development is not adapted or implemented, a company loses out. But there's no corollary to this in politics. So sometimes you might see a politician losing because there's another political actor who performs better than them, and there's a clear disparity between the two, or if a politician loses favor among their constituency. But even in democracies, there's not always such a clear cause and effect. So if you look at any polling on the U.S. Congress, Americans have an overwhelmingly negative view of Congress. And you would think that this would drive change in either the House of Representatives or the Senate, or hopefully both. Only it doesn't. Predominantly because, despite the fact that most Americans view Congress as an institution overwhelmingly negatively, they view their personal representatives in Congress well. And this creates a lack of clear indicators. So why should Congress reform if every person who is in Congress has the support of their constituency? And if they didn't, then they'd be voted out. But that doesn't fix the fact that Congress doesn't function very often as it is intended to do so. It's a very stagnant political body that does not accomplish what the majority of Americans want it to. And this difference in ratings means that increasing returns continue to happen despite the fact that it is not popular. And if it was an economic rather than political entity, it would have been reformed or exchanged for a different mode of operation a lot longer ago. But keep in mind, this does not mean that politics is static. So there are still changes and fluctuations that happen even with increasing returns. And while this means that it may be costly to change course, it does not mean that changing course is impossible. And it may mean that instead of seeing huge shifts, we'll see more subtle drifting in the purposes of the institutions that do exist. And this leads us to how political science deals with the idea of path dependence. So Pearson talks a lot about the importance of critical junctures in his piece. So this is when an event fundamentally changes the structure of society. So the collapse of the Soviet Union, a revolution, a civil war, perhaps even the changing of a political party if it's dramatic enough in its goal and scope. You could argue that the election of Barack Obama was a critical juncture in American politics. You could argue that the election of Donald Trump was also a critical juncture. And Pearson makes the argument that you require a critical juncture because of the path-dependent nature of politics. You need a major event to cause lasting change. And you have to create a sufficient impetus to overcome the costs of exit. However, when we look at politics, we can see a countervailing idea, which is that we don't necessarily see a lot of change from critical junctures, that a lot of these informal institutions can survive that upset. So a lot of norms of everyday behavior or local organization or collective action can survive these critical junctures. And instead what we see is institutional drift. And institutional drift is when institutions change more subtly. So they move over time. And this movement can happen whether there is a critical junction or there's not. So the purpose and role of informal institutions change over time. Rather than being completely done away with, the institution will change radically if you look at it from its endpoint to its start, but the change occurs slowly over time, either by it drifting away from its original purpose, maybe layer a couple of institutions on top of one another, and this is subtle, slow change to the institution. And this idea pulls less from ideas of economics and more from the explicit study of informal institutions and ethnography in particular, looking how certain cultural practices are carried out in locations over time and how that's changed. But both critical junctures and institutional drift have impacts on what is often the main goal of political science, which is developing theories that have parsimony, so they are easy to understand. So the fewer moving parts in a theory, typically the better it is thought to be. So the more you can explain with the fewer variables, the more parsimonious your theory is. And that these theories are actually predictable, that we can predict what will happen based off of those key indicators. And Pearson really critiques this goal of political science, arguing that because of the path-dependent nature, we don't know which variables are critical at the start, and that critical variable might be different and oftentimes is different in every case, and that you need to pay attention to the role of time and the historical context. But this kind of deep history or historical structuralism means that you can explain an individual case very well, but means that you cannot generalize a lot of your findings. And we also encounter a problem with this where we have a lot of variables in political science, but not enough cases to test them all. So unlike the hard sciences, so unlike chemistry or biology or even physics, we cannot conduct laboratory experiments. Unfortunately, it's really hard to lock two countries in a room together and see how long it'll take for them to declare war holding all else constant. Or to place a country in a box and see how its economy develops. So we cannot conduct controlled experiments. Every now and again, we'll encounter natural experiments, and those are really, really interesting to see. And it's wonderful when we have the data to set that up, but oftentimes we lack that degree of certainty where we are forced to conduct experiments while human error is both on the side of the researcher and on that being researched. And while that complexity that Pearson talks about does exist, and we do have this path dependency, and we want to consider the role of time and everything's historical context, it's hard to do that while systematically studying political developments. And this is something that political science has to balance. That what political scientists are trying to do is different from what historians or ethnographers or sociologists are trying to do with their research. And this doesn't make political science less valid as a field. It just means that it's trying to do something different in applying the scientific method to something where we cannot do laboratory experiments. But this is something to keep in mind as we move forward with things that we're studying about Central Asia. Can we develop an understanding of causal variables? Is there a way to generate predictable outcomes? Are the findings from Central Asia generalizable to regions outside? And in a way, we're trying to balance this kind of need for parsimony and predictability in political science with the importance of history and regional studies, where we could have a course on all of these ideas and on institutions that is absent of the kind of deep regional study that we are going to be conducting. But this kind of focus on a single region and the political developments within it is also within the realm of political science. And we're focusing on a single region of the world to both become more familiar with it and to balance this need for intense case studies in political science to get at those kinds of historic reasonings and that knowledge of informal and formal institutions that you can't get if you're looking at a more broad picture of the world. And one of the ways that political scientists operate is by studying deviant cases. And the cases from Central Asia both sometimes fall within the realm of being typical cases in what are generalizable social science studies. But sometimes they're also that case that is an outlier. And both are important to study and provide unique insights into human relations. So turning to this week's readings, looking at the Soviet collapse and kind of the institutional framework of the states and the informal sources of local governance, our readings deal with two things. And one is a critical juncture, and the other one is focusing kind of this idea of institutional drift. And so first we're going to discuss how a critical juncture has impacted the institutions of Central Asia, that being the Soviet collapse. So one of the first major reactions we have in the institutional apparatus in Central Asia as a result of the Soviet collapse is a massive period of structural adjustment. And so structural adjustment refers to the privatization of government assets, which we talked about in our last lecture, but also included the adoption of convertible currencies, the liberalization, and the liberalization of trade. Sometimes this process involved something referred to as shock therapy. So this was a rapid version of the process of structural adjustment that is sometimes likened to using a defibrillator. So instead of slowly transitioning Soviet economies away from socialism, shock therapy was meant to shock economies into being market economies instead. So it was meant to essentially move these economies very rapidly into being more westernized market economies. And these relied on massive upheavals and rapid reform, along with an influx of foreign capital to make this transition. But structural adjustment affected regions of the former USSR differently, depending on a variety of features, but primarily differing along their relative wealth at the time of the Soviet collapse. So poorer countries were much quicker to institute reforms, and they instituted faster reforms. So the poorer you were, the more likely you were to implement shock therapy, whereas richer states were able to resist or ignore outside demands. And so one way to look at this is that richer states were able to be less beholden to outside powers in this immediate period after the Soviet collapse. And so we see structural adjustment affecting the Central Asian states differently. So first looking at Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was the richest of the Central Asian republics at the time of the Soviet collapse and was able to negotiate its transition to capitalism. The high oil prices at the time of the Soviet collapse were key to allowing its government to maintain solvency and balance its budget without a huge influx of foreign capital or taking in massive loans. And because it didn't need these loans, it was less likely to require to institute reforms along the lines of shock therapy. And the country has seen stable growth despite the fact that it didn't institute shock therapy, and it has the highest GDP per capita. Now, as we've discussed before, its wealth distribution is still a key issue, and they have a lot of wealth disparity between urban and rural areas in Kazakhstan, and the oil boom has essentially created an economic elite, and we haven't seen much distribution of that wealth to the whole of the population. But of the former Central Asian Soviet republics, it has seen the greatest economic success in the time period after. But it's important to keep in mind that there is a degree of endogeneity to this. So within the Soviet Union, it was also one of the most economically powerful states, and it was able to maintain that in this post-Soviet era. But this is also largely due to the fact that it had oil and gas reserves. If it had not had something that was valued so highly on the global market, it might not have received quite as much attention as it did, and it might not have been able to maintain its economic performance in that post-Soviet era. And we have seen Kazakhstan perhaps being victim of the Dutch disease in the modern political era, where still its economy is highly dependent upon those oil and gas resources to this day and maintaining higher prices on that resource. But oil and gas are not an end-all be-all. So Turkmenistan also had oil and gas resources, but it was the poorest in Central Asia. We've seen modest reforms, but the state is still largely in control of key sectors and businesses. And part of this stems from the fact that oil and gas tends to be a nationalized resource. So while the country is very poor, the money that the country is making off of those oil and gas resources is funneled directly into the state that the state can then pay out to key supporters in the form of private goods to those individuals. Additionally, its feuds with Russia and the lack of pipelines to other countries has resulted in poor economic growth in the country. So we've seen it largely economically stagnate. And there's still high levels of inequality and a poor standard of living, and there's still frequent human rights abuses with a strong authoritarian regime. So we have seen several government crackdowns and a lack of human rights in Turkmenistan vis-a-vis Kazakhstan, who does not have quite as bad as a record as Turkmenistan on that front, despite both having similar access to natural resources. Thirdly, we have Uzbekistan, who at the time of the Soviet collapse had the largest population, but it was also the least open to market reforms. And as a result, it was able to retain control over its financial sector. But it's still very reliant on cotton sales, and it's still primarily an agricultural economy. After Karimov's death, we've seen it switch course a bit. So the Soviet collapse didn't cause them to open up their economy, but Karimov's death in the post-Soviet era, so he died in 2016, has triggered a bit of a political opening, and this opening has largely come through in the form of an expansion of its economic prospects. So we've seen it open up a little bit more to the global economy, and especially to the regional economy in Central Asia. But initially, after the Soviet collapse, it had the most closed-off economy of any of the Central Asian states, not just to Western actors, but also to other states in Central Asia. But this policy, while it initially insulated Uzbekistan, the benefits of it have been declining over time due to bureaucratic decay and the lack of economic opportunities. This economic opening that we've seen after Karimov seems to be a means of stabilizing the new rulership. So controlled elements of economic liberalization are meant to establish the loyalty of the ruling elite to the new autocrat. So it's unlikely that without any other major upsets that this will be accompanied by any sort of political expansion of rights or the establishment of new institutions. It's largely enabled a corrupt government apparatus to continue existing. During the Soviet collapse, Kyrgyzstan was one of the two poorest of the Central Asian republics alongside Tajikistan, and it agreed to the most extensive version of shock therapy in Central Asia. The problem with this was that the economy actually contracted after undergoing shock therapy. So after the Soviet collapse and after shock therapy, rather than being part of a functioning westernized market economy, the Kyrgyzstan was left with millions of dollars in loans to pay off, but also less economic productivity to generate the funds to pay off those loans. So it has made the situation in Kyrgyzstan worse and perhaps has limited their ability to see economic growth and development in the later 1990s and into the 2000s. Tajikistan, much like Kyrgyzstan, agreed to extensive reforms, but the fact that it collapsed into civil war in 1992 prevented the implementation of most of these reforms. And while it was the poorest in the region, Rahmon reneged on many of those promises to reform after the civil war ended. So we've seen Tajikistan become much more insular. So rather than pursuing structural adjustment, it's much more been a case of authoritarian consolidation of power, where the state has been more interested in maintaining stability than actually merging its economy with that of the West. And Western political thinkers initially during the Soviet collapse were under the impression that this structural adjustment would lead to increased democratization, but what we've seen throughout most of post-Soviet space is that shock therapy and structural adjustment are highly destabilizing to those institutional frameworks. And rather than creating an opening for the establishment of new institutions, it's largely enabled a corrupt government apparatus to continue existing. During the post-Soviet period, international actors were also not just interested in changing the economic institutions of the Central Asian states, they were interested in changing the civil society and social institutions as well. So this occurred alongside structural adjustment reforms. And while it was not focused on the economies in these countries directly, it was focused on building civil society and building formal and informal institutions that were meant to build capacity. So they were trying to change the underlying political and social institutions. And part of this was to go along with the idea that modernization and economic growth coincided with transition to democracy. So this was a means to jumpstart citizen involvement. And another part of this was meant to empower the citizenry, so to encourage activism and to overcome what was the perceived Soviet-era apathy to politics. However, there were many problems with this approach. So much like transition theory, it ignored the historical context of Central Asia. So during Perestroika, Gorbachev had actually encouraged local organizations and local activism. But these largely evaporated in the post-Soviet era because they were ignored by Western donors, or Western donors didn't perceive these as authentic expressions of citizens' political desires. So the power of these institutions largely dropped off during the post-Soviet period, and they didn't receive additional government funding, and and Western actors weren't interested in continuing their existence. And instead, Western donors were interested in creating new non-government organizations, so creating new NGOs in the region. But the power of these institutions to influence politics was somewhat suspect because they were beholden to outside funds. So they were not organic to society, and they were reliant on outside cash flows, and Western donors also often had a lack of knowledge of what was wrong with local politics or with local interests in Central Asia. So what Western actors desired to fund was not necessarily what was best for society or what individuals wanted. So there was a mismatch between the programs being promoted by NGOs and what was actually needed by society. We also see Western interests being kind of fickle. So they're highly dependent on what has captured the interests of the international community. And so these projects were short-term oftentimes and interested in projects that had high returns. And these were the two major concerns of Western donors, that they could achieve high returns in a short amount of time. But this is not how local activism often works. It often takes time, and it is something that generates benefits over that time frame that it's active. And so a lot of these policies have backfired in that they're actually increasing societal programs, and the loan programs have not been working or fulfilling their desires, and these programs wind up supporting the elite, not promoting democracy. So a lot of the Western donor money winds up helping elites consolidate power rather than enabling local activism. And that happens largely because of a confluence of all of these factors. So a lack of knowledge of what are the problems on the ground, a lack of desire to fund what people express desire to have done, and kind of this desire to see quick results meant that, much like what we saw with the elite capture of state assets in kind of this economic period after the Soviet collapse. We also see elites able to capture these Western-funded NGOs as well. So these wind up serving elite purposes rather than doing what Western donors actually wanted, which was the opposite of kind of fulfilling and empowering the civil society of these states in Central Asia. So we do see a high degree of institutional change with the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was an intense amount of desire from international actors to see the institutional framework of Central Asia change quickly and dramatically in order to integrate Central Asia with the global economy and the global governing system. And this really meant a twofold process of creating capitalist economies and also trying to push a transition to democracy. But despite the presence of this critical juncture, a lot of the underlying institutions of the Soviet era or even earlier have survived this critical juncture. And we see this particularly coming to the fore in informal politics in Central Asia, where local governance still has a tremendous amount of power and influence over the everyday life of the citizenry of these countries. And this is where we see a lot of dense social networking and civil society networks that have had a tremendous amount of influence over the governing of Central Asia and have managed to survive numerous different political apparatuses. And so while the Soviet collapse overturned much of civil society and the formal institutions of the state, this just means that individuals have turned more to these informal institutions of governance. Because these have proven more resilient in this time of political, economic, and societal uncertainty. So one of the first pieces we read for this class was looking at Central Asia as local. And one of the things that Liu talked about in this piece was these mahallas, these local village governing structures that have existed for centuries in Central Asia as a form of customary governance and of local organization, where there are dense social networks and an intense interpersonal knowledge between individuals. And these mahallas and customary forms of governance are not static or frozen. They've changed with the times and often have changed quite dramatically. But there is an underlying degree of stability with these forms of local organization, even as they respond to developments in the state and in society. And this rule and governance and organization occurs outside the direct purview of the state. So it's an informal means of organization that sometimes may overlap with the state, but this is not necessary for the continued existence of these forms of customary governance. And it really serves two purposes. And so on one hand, they exist due to state weakness. So the state lacks the ability to provide public goods. And so these mahallas step in to fill this role and provide welfare or social connections, loans, conflict resolution, justice, an informal legal system, and a sense of order on society when the state cannot or will not provide those to its citizens. This fills that gap in social relations. And so last lecture we talked about the Hobbesian state of nature where life is nasty, brutish, and short without a state leviathan. These forms of customary governance run counter to that, where we lack a state leviathan. The state is incredibly weak and lacks an institutional framework or the ability to govern its territory. And rather than dissolve into chaos, we have these local governments stepping in to fill in that gap, to provide for kind of their local social network. These mohallas wouldn't be able to govern a state, but they are able to provide a source of stability and order to their local region. Secondly, mohallas can be used to avoid the encroachment of the state. So in this situation, the state is not weak, but people still, either because they don't like it or they don't agree with it, do not want to be subject to the governance of the state. So maybe they're not co-ethnics with the state, they aren't from the same lineage or kinship network, and so the state would discriminate against them. But because they know that, they're able to more readily turn towards their local government for things that they require, and basic necessities that the state would be unwilling to provide if it was able to govern that territory. But because they're able to combat the influence of the state, they can continue to exist. And as long as individuals choose to turn towards that form of customary governance first, they continue to exist even if the state has the power to potentially overwhelm that particular locale. So oftentimes the state lacks the knowledge to get rid of these forms of customary governance. And this is due to the fact that these groups often avoid the encroachment of the state when the state lacks a history of government with that region. So these groups lack trust in the state. And to combat their lack of trust, they continue to rely on their local social organizations. And these mohallas and villages are long-standing government structures, more so than any of the actual governments in Central Asia. And so much like when we were talking about informal institutions at the beginning of this lecture, we see these being the institutions that drive trust and that actually serve to lower the transaction cost between individuals. And it is a form of normative behavior that has a deep cultural context and cultural continuity that is able to overcome the instability on the level of the state. And we see these forms of informal governance of these mohallas being a threat to the state in some ways. So these institutions are not completely isolated from the state. Mohallas and kinship networks are a potential threat to state consolidation. They can act against the state and they're difficult to monitor, and the state may lack local knowledge. And so it's easier for groups that are more reliant on these mohallas to avoid punishment from the state. And so people turn to the mohallas, not their state, incredibly often for things that theoretically the state should be the one to provide, whether this be punishment or justice or public goods. And so this highly local governance is able to better respond. It's able to respond quicker, more efficiently to the needs and desires of that local population. So they're highly embedded in the local environment in a way that a new or struggling state cannot be locally embedded. They lack the capacity to be everywhere. And because of that, these local governments are better able to respond. These organizations can also act as political gatekeepers. We can see this in Kyrgyzstan. So there's 40 major lineages in Kyrgyzstan that are still highly active, and this is how one deems themselves to be Kyrgyz, is that they can trace their lineage back to one of these 40 families. And it is through membership and engagement with these lineage groups that one is able to achieve political advancement. Now, officially, these lineages are not allowed to engage in politics, but in practice, you need clan or lineage backing to have political success. And so, once again, this acts as a potential threat to the state and its centralization. And so, these lineage networks in Kyrgyzstan do help prevent authoritarian consolidation in Kyrgyzstan, because the fact that there are 40 different lineages means that there has to be some power transfer or decentralization of power with the other lineages to maintain power. One lineage cannot maintain power alone. It has to have the support of others, which means that there has to be some allowance of influence and some devolution of state power to those actors. Even if they can't officially be political actors, they are very much embedded into the political game. And this is despite the fact that some people have negative associations with these kinds of lineage networks. So some perceive these as backwards or pre-modern, especially those who were who came of age during the Soviet period, because Soviet propaganda was very keen on portraying these kind of local governances as backwards because they threatened the Soviet rule of the state, where they were less able to govern these locales because of the presence of mukhallas or lineages or clans. But still, engagement is crucial. So much like membership in the Communist Party was necessary for political advancement in the USSR, you now see membership in these kinds of local organizations being necessary for any sort of political advancement in Central Asian politics nowadays. And these networks have survived a long time. So once again, it is important to note that these are an important and crucial source of stability in these countries, where their political systems are often in a high state of flux. And even if there is some degree of authoritarian consolidation, that authoritarian consolidation cannot overcome, oftentimes, these forms of local governance. And in order to overcome them, it requires a high amount of local trauma to root out these kinds of local organizations. So it is incredibly costly for the state to go in and overwhelm mukhallas or kinship or clan networks. And even if they were to do so, these kinds of organizations are crucial to identity. And anytime you get into identity politics, it's very difficult to strip people of an identity that they already consider intrinsic to their existence. And so if you go into Kyrgyzstan and try to root out these 40 lineage networks, you are threatening the existential existence of what it means to be Kyrgyz. And the state cannot do that without facing political threats from local mobilization. And in Central Asia, we have seen these local governances treated differently by different regimes. So the capture of these mukhallas is central towards the consolidation of authoritarian rule. And so between Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan, we've seen a variety of policies towards these populations and to this form of governance as these states try to solidify their rule. So Uzbekistan has aimed to co-opt its local rule and mukhallas. So it's aiming for state capture of all levels of political space. And it wants these mukhallas to serve the state rather than local interests. And it's done so by giving mukhallas official power. So rather than being informal forms of governance and informal institutions, the Uzbek government has aimed at creating formal governance out of these mukhalla structures. And by doing so, they're actually curtailing the freedom and autonomy of the mullahs because they're now brought under the purview of the state. However, it is questionable how effective this has been. So even if you formalize the various positions within a muqawla, and they even have a position that the state's created that it is an informant. So rather than serving the local population, this is meant to inform the government of the ongoing happenings in a given muqawla, which is meant to overcome the state's inability to monitor this type of governance. You still see people having a tremendous amount of trust in the mullahs, and the mullahs still working to serve local interests, despite the fact that theoretically the state is in the process of co-opting them. You've seen a less aggressive strategy in Tajikistan, where they've had a mostly laissez-faire approach to their local and customary forms of governance, where they've largely neglected them and allowed them political space to operate independently of the state. And this is because the Civil War highly disrupted the official government, and local governance was deemed crucial to the continuing stability of the state. Additionally, the local government lacked the capacity to monitor the mullahs. So unlike Uzbekistan, the Tajik government does not have the capacity to co-opt. So rather than co-opting mullahs, they've created an aggregate of several villages that they monitor at once, but this gives a tremendous amount of leeway to that local governance. So even if the state is highly authoritarian and more repressive, if they lack the ability to monitor, then there's more autonomy and independence given to the mullahs and this local governing structure that doesn't exist when the state's trying to co-opt them. Afghanistan has probably had the most aggressive policy with regards to mullahs than Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. Rather than allowing them independence or attempting to co-opt them, the Afghan government has sought to replace the forms of customary governance. It was assumed that mullahs had either withered away during the various conflicts that have been ongoing in Afghanistan, or that the mullahs continue to exist but were an impediment to democracy and development. However, despite the government's interest in replacing mullahs, and even though they had Western backing and Western funding for their effort to do so, these have been an important and resilient form of local organization that still have high support levels from the population. And especially compared to the formal government bodies, there is an obvious preference for these forms of customary governance over the state. So looking at the informal institutions in Central Asia, we see a high degree of historical continuity, particularly on the local level. So we see local governance having a tremendous amount of influence on the population of Central Asia, despite the fact that there's been numerous critical junctures and the overthrow of several governments. And perhaps this continuity and the focus on local power has persisted because the state has been so unstable. And this instability on the national or regional level has resulted in a reliance on the form of governance that has been able to persist over this time period. And so, despite the various critical junctures of the opportunities to deviate from their path dependency, we've seen these institutions very resistant to change. And they have been resistant to change both fueled by the international community pushing certain reforms or funding efforts, and resistant to authoritarian states attempting to change how these locales govern themselves. So we've seen a very interesting dynamic in Central Asia that is sometimes overlooked by outside actors. It's easy to look at Central Asia and see a collection of authoritarian regimes, and authoritarian regimes that are not particularly effective at that. But the ineffectiveness of these authoritarian regimes and the harshness of their rule overlays a highly complex network of local customary governance that is much more democratic than what we see on the national level, where the community comes together to select the leaders of these muhallas, or they're run by councils or committees. So we don't see the authoritarian rule that is present on the national level reflected in these kinship networks and these lineage groups or in muhallas. And that's a particularly interesting break between the two that should not be overlooked moving forward. And we've seen aspects of these informal institutions kind of change or shift over time. And really, in the post-Soviet era, if anything, they've acquired additional power and influence over the locales where they're active. So despite the lack of rule of law and the lack of functioning governing institutions that we saw in Tuesday's readings, here we see a robust system of informal institutionalism that serves to counteract state weakness and state abuses. And it's on that thought that I'll leave you off for today. I look forward to hearing all of your thoughts on Thursday. No.